In the suffocating silence of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, a single sentence would shatter a billionaire's world and expose a 15-year-old conspiracy that had buried the truth so deep, even the victim had forgotten she was once someone else entirely. What Maya Chen said wasn't meant to change anything. She was just a tired waitress trying to make small talk with a man who could buy and sell her entire neighborhood without checking his bank balance. But those 7 innocent words would act like a detonator, exploding through layers of carefully constructed lies and triggering a collapse so violent it would leave paramedics scrambling and a tech mogul's empire hanging in the balance. The ring around her neck was supposed to be nothing more than a family heirloom, a simple comfort from a grandmother's jewelry box. She had no idea it was actually evidence of the most ruthless kidnapping in corporate history. She had no idea the fragile woman she called grandmother was living under a stolen identity, her true self buried beneath 15 years of carefully orchestrated amnesia. And she certainly had no idea that the cold, calculating stranger sitting at table 12 was searching for the same ghost that haunted her mother's broken memories every single night. What happened next defied every law of probability. A chance encounter that should have been impossible. A recognition that transcended time, memory, and even death itself. Because sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of justice, and sometimes the most powerful men on Earth are brought to their knees, not by hostile takeovers or market crashes, but by a minimum wage waitress wearing her grandmother's jewelry. This is the story of how 4 simple words changed 3 lives forever, and how love found a way to survive even when everything else had been systematically destroyed. The air inside Elite was different from the rest of New York City. It was filtered, purified, cleansed of the desperation and grit that clung to the streets 40 floors below, leaving only the intoxicating scent of truffle risotto, aged leather, and the kind of money that whispered instead of shouting. For 22-year-old Maya Chen, it was a world she was permitted to serve, but never to inhabit. 6 nights a week, she transformed herself from a struggling daughter into the perfect invisible servant, trading her worn-out sneakers for polished black flats, her anxiety for a practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. Her real life existed in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in Chinatown, where the air smelled of medicinal herbs and the weight of impossible choices. Her mother, Sarah Chen, was slowly disappearing before her eyes, claimed by early-onset dementia at only 57. The woman who had once worked 3 jobs to put Maya through college now forgot her daughter's name on bad days, staring at familiar faces as if they were strangers who had wandered into her living room uninvited. Their most precious possession hung around Sarah's neck on a delicate silver chain, catching the light from their single window like a beacon of hope in their darkening world. It was an antique sapphire ring, intricate and clearly expensive, carved with tiny phoenixes that seemed to dance around a deep blue stone. Sarah called it her mother's ring, the only thing of value her family had ever owned, passed down through generations of women who had dreamed of better lives but settled for survival. Maya had never questioned the story. Why would she? Her grandmother had died when Maya was 5, leaving behind only faded photographs and this single piece of jewelry that seemed too beautiful for their humble circumstances. But families had treasures, didn't they? Even poor families sometimes possessed one perfect thing that connected them to a past worth remembering. Tonight, Maya's section at Elite was graced by a legend, a man whose name appeared on magazine covers and business journals with religious frequency. Theodore Blackstone was more than wealthy. He was a force of nature, a tech visionary whose artificial intelligence innovations had revolutionized entire industries and made him $40 billion richer than most small countries. But success had hollowed him out, carved away everything soft and human, until only the sharp edges remained. He sat alone at table 12, overlooking Central Park through floor-to-ceiling windows, a king surveying his domain. The other servers avoided him instinctively, sensing the aura of profound grief that surrounded him like an invisible barrier. His tragedy was legend in certain circles. 15 years ago, his 16-year-old daughter Emma had been kidnapped from their estate in the Hamptons. The ransom was paid, $25 million transferred to untraceable accounts. But Emma Blackstone never came home. Theodore Blackstone came to Elite every year on the anniversary of that loss, ordering the same meal Emma had requested for her 17th birthday, a celebration that never came. He was a man dining with ghosts, and tonight he was about to meet one. Maya approached table 12 with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to become invisible in plain sight. Her hands steady despite the tremor in her heart, she carried the evening's signature appetizer, a delicate arrangement of seared foie gras that cost more than her monthly rent. Theodore Blackstone didn't look up from his phone, his fingers moving across the screen with the mechanical precision of a man who controlled empires through digital commands. The glow from the device cast harsh shadows across his angular face, highlighting the deep lines that 15 years of grief had carved into what had once been considered one of New York's most handsome faces. Maya had served powerful men before, but never one who seemed to radiate such profound emptiness, as if someone had reached inside him and scooped out everything that made him human. She cleared her throat softly, the sound barely audible above the restaurant's orchestral background music. "Good evening, Mr. Blackstone," she said, her voice carrying the polished professionalism she had perfected over countless shifts. "Tonight's amuse-bouche is a pan-seared foie gras with black truffle reduction and micro-herbs, paired with our sommelier's selection of Dom Perignon 1996. Theodore's eyes remained fixed on his screen, but Maya caught the slight tightening around his mouth, a barely perceptible shift that suggested her presence was an unwelcome interruption to whatever digital fortress he had built around himself. She set the plate down with practiced silence, each movement calculated to create the least possible disturbance to his solitary vigil. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled only by the distant murmur of other diners and the soft clink of expensive silverware against fine china. Maya had served in different billionaires before, men who treated service staff like pieces of furniture, but there was something different about Theodore's dismissal. It wasn't arrogance, it was self-preservation. The ring around Maya's neck caught the candlelight as she leaned forward to adjust his water glass, the ancient sapphire throwing tiny blue reflections across the white tablecloth like scattered stars. It was a nervous habit she had developed over the years, unconsciously touching the silver chain whenever she felt anxious or out of place, which was practically every moment she spent inside Elite's rarefied atmosphere. The ring was her anchor to the real world, a reminder that somewhere beyond these gilded walls, her mother was probably sitting alone in their small apartment, staring at old photographs and trying to remember the names of people who had once meant everything to her. Maya's fingers traced the delicate chain as she watched Theodore's reflection in the window, this powerful man who seemed to be drowning in his own success. She wondered what it would be like to have so much money that you could buy anything except the one thing you actually wanted, to live in a world where every door opened for you except the one that led back to happiness. The thought made her unconsciously grip the ring tighter, feeling the raised pattern of the tiny phoenixes against her palm. As Maya turned to leave, Theodore finally looked up from his phone, and for one heart-stopping moment, his piercing grey eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that seemed to strip away all her careful defenses. It wasn't the casual dismissal she had expected, but something deeper and more unsettling, a recognition that made no sense, as if he were seeing not Maya Chen the waitress, but someone else entirely, someone from a life he thought he had lost forever. His gaze dropped to her throat, where the sapphire ring rested against her pulse point, and Maya watched in fascination and growing alarm as every drop of color drained from his face. Theodore's hand, which had been steady enough to negotiate billion-dollar deals, began to tremble as he stared at the piece of jewelry, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. Maya instinctively took a step backward, her training screaming at her to retreat, to become invisible again, but she found herself frozen by the raw anguish that was spreading across his features like cracks in breaking ice. Something was terribly wrong, but she had no idea that she was looking at a man who had just seen his daughter's ghost wearing his daughter's ring. The silence at table 12 stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap under the weight of 15 years of buried grief. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched Theodore Blackstone transform before her eyes, his legendary composure crumbling like ancient parchment exposed to flame. The other diners continued their conversations in blissful ignorance, unaware that one of the most powerful men in America was having what appeared to be a complete psychological breakdown just a few feet away. Maya's training kicked in. She should call for the manager, she should step back, she should do anything except stand there staring at this titan of industry who looked like he'd just seen the devil himself. But something in his expression held her captive. A desperate vulnerability so raw and unexpected that it felt almost obscene to witness. She found herself speaking without thinking, her voice soft and concerned, the natural empathy that her mother had instilled in her overriding every rule she'd learned about maintaining professional distance. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked, her words barely above a whisper. "You look like you've seen a ghost." The irony of her choice of words would haunt her for the rest of her life, but in that moment, she was simply a young woman, concerned about a stranger's well-being. Theodore's eyes snapped back to her face, searching her features with a frantic intensity that made her skin crawl. He was looking for something, some confirmation of an impossible theory that was forming in his brilliant mind. Maya touched the ring nervously, a gesture that made Theodore's breath catch audibly in his throat. She tried to fill the awkward silence with the kind of small talk that usually put uncomfortable customers at ease, though nothing about this situation could be described as usual. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said, lifting the ring slightly so it caught the candlelight. "The craftsmanship is incredible. These little phoenixes look like they're about to take flight." She smiled, trying to inject some warmth into the frigid atmosphere. "I wear it every day for luck. My grandmother always said it was one of a kind, made by some famous jeweler decades ago." The words hit Theodore like physical blows, each syllable driving the impossible truth deeper into his consciousness. One of a kind. Famous jeweler. The description was perfect, down to the phoenixes that he had specifically requested to symbolize rebirth and eternal love. His mind raced through the implications, the mathematical impossibility of coincidence warring against the evidence of his own eyes. He tried to speak, but his voice came out as a broken croak that bore no resemblance to the commanding baritone that had intimidated corporate boards around the world. Maya leaned forward slightly, genuinely concerned now, and Theodore caught a scent that stopped his heart. Lavender and vanilla, the exact perfume Emma had worn, a custom blend he'd had made for her 16th birthday. The room began to spin, reality tilting on its axis as 15 years of carefully constructed assumptions crumbled into dust. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white with the effort of staying upright, and managed to force out the question that would change everything. "Your grandmother, what was her name?" But even as the words left his lips, Maya was already answering with the 7 words that would detonate his world. "Sir, my mom has the same ring," Maya said, her voice taking on an almost dreamlike quality as she continued, unaware that she was about to trigger an earthquake. "She wears hers on a chain just like this one, only hers is bigger. The original, she says. She's had it since before I was born, calls it her anchor to a life she can't remember." Theodore's fork clattered to the floor, the sound echoing through the restaurant like a gunshot. Every muscle in his body went rigid as the words processed, each one landing like a hammer blow against his chest. The original. A life she can't remember. The blood drained from his face so completely that Maya thought he might actually be dying, his skin taking on a waxy, greyish pallor that made her wonder if she should call 911. His eyes, those piercing grey eyes that had once been compared to winter storms, were now wide with a terror so profound it seemed to swallow all the light in the room. "What did you say?" he whispered, his voice barely human. "What did you just say?" But before Maya could repeat herself, before she could ask what was wrong, Theodore Blackstone's body betrayed him completely. His eyes rolled back in his head, showing only whites, and he pitched forward with a sound that was half gasp, half scream, his massive frame hitting the marble floor with a sickening thud that sent shockwaves of panic through the exclusive dining room. The sound of Theodore Blackstone's collapse was like a grenade detonating in a cathedral. The hushed elegance of elite shattered instantly as the city's most powerful tech mogul lay unconscious on the Persian carpet, his limbs splayed at unnatural angles, his face a mask of deathly pallor. Maya's scream pierced the air, a sound of pure terror that cut through the genteel murmur of conversation like a blade through silk. Crystal glasses shattered as patrons knocked over their drinks in their haste to see what had happened, and within seconds, the orderly sanctuary of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant had transformed into a scene of barely controlled chaos. The maitre d', a perpetually composed Frenchman named Henri, appeared at Maya's side as if materialized from thin air, his professional mask slipping to reveal genuine alarm as he took in the sight of their most influential patron, crumpled on the floor like a broken marionette. "Mon Dieu," he whispered, then immediately switched to rapid-fire commands in English. "Someone call 911, now! Clear the area! Get me the manager!" But his voice seemed to come from very far away as Maya stared down at the man whose world she had just inadvertently destroyed with 7 innocent words. Theodore's body convulsed once, a violent spasm that sent his water glass flying, drenching the nearby tablecloth in ice water that spread like a slow-motion explosion across the pristine linen. Maya dropped to her knees beside him, her waitressing uniform soaking up the spreading puddle as she instinctively reached out to check for a pulse, her first aid training from community college taking over, even as her mind reeled with confusion and guilt. His skin was cold and clammy, but his heart was racing like a hummingbird's wings beneath her fingertips, and she could see his eyes moving frantically beneath closed lids as if he were trapped in some terrible nightmare. "Sir, can you hear me?" she whispered, leaning close to his ear. "Help is coming, just hold on." Around them, the chaos intensified as other diners either pressed closer for a better look or fled toward the exits, their expensive evening ruined by this unexpected brush with mortality. A woman in diamonds was weeping hysterically, convinced she had witnessed a murder, while a man in a tuxedo was live-streaming the scene on his phone until Henri snatched the device away with a sharp reprimand about privacy and discretion. The sound of approaching sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. As the paramedics burst through the restaurant's mahogany doors, their equipment clanking and their radios crackling with urgent chatter, a man in an impeccably tailored suit, who had been dining alone at a corner table, suddenly materialized beside the chaos. This was Marcus Webb, Theodore's personal attorney, and the closest thing to a friend that the reclusive billionaire had allowed himself in 15 years. Marcus had been having his usual Thursday dinner at Elite when he heard the commotion, and now he stood over his client's unconscious form with the grim expression of a man who had been expecting this moment for years. "Step back, everyone," he commanded, his voice carrying an authority that made even the paramedics pause momentarily. "I'm his lawyer. What happened here?" His sharp eyes immediately locked onto Maya, who was still kneeling beside Theodore, her uniform stained and her face streaked with tears she didn't remember shedding. Marcus had spent enough time in courtrooms to recognize a key witness when he saw one, and something about this young woman's stricken expression told him she was more than just an innocent bystander to this medical emergency. The lead paramedic, a weathered man in his 50s who had seen every kind of emergency Manhattan could produce, was already working with practiced efficiency, checking Theodore's vitals and preparing to transport him to the hospital. "Looks like a severe anxiety attack or psychological shock," he reported to his partner. "Pulse is erratic but strong, blood pressure through the roof. We need to get him stabilized." As they lifted Theodore onto a stretcher, Marcus turned his full attention to Maya, his laser-sharp legal mind already cataloguing details and formulating questions. "What's your name?" he asked, not unkindly, but with an intensity that made Maya shrink back. "Maya Chen," she stammered, suddenly very aware that she was now the center of attention in a room full of people who could buy and sell her entire neighborhood. "I'm just a waitress. I didn't do anything wrong." But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't entirely true. She had done something. She had spoken about her mother's ring, had mentioned words that had somehow triggered this catastrophic reaction. Marcus pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly, already setting in motion the machinery that protected Theodore Blackstone's interests. "Miss Chen," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "I'm going to need you to come with us to the hospital. Whatever you said to Mr. Blackstone, it's clear that it was significant. We need to understand exactly what happened here tonight." Mount Sinai's VIP wing existed in a different universe from the chaos of the main hospital, where the wealthy came to heal in hotel-like suites that bore no resemblance to standard medical facilities. The floor was accessible only by private elevator, staffed by doctors who had signed ironclad non-disclosure agreements and decorated with museum-quality art that probably cost more than most people's houses. Maya sat in the waiting area, feeling completely out of place among the leather furniture and marble surfaces, her stained uniform a stark reminder of the world she actually inhabited. She had called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years, knowing that Henri would probably fire her regardless. Waitresses who caused billionaire customers to collapse weren't exactly employable at establishments like Elite. Marcus Webb paced the hallway like a caged tiger, his phone pressed to his ear as he coordinated with Theodore's security team, his personal doctor, and what sounded like half the board of directors at Blackstone Technologies. Every few minutes, he would glance at Maya with the calculating expression of a chess master studying his opponent, clearly trying to piece together the puzzle of what had triggered his client's breakdown. The attending physician, Dr. Sarah Martinez, emerged from Theodore's suite with the grim expression of someone who had spent her career treating the ultra-wealthy and their unique brand of complicated medical issues. "He's stable now," she reported to Marcus, her voice professional but tinged with curiosity. "All his vital signs are normal. But this wasn't a heart attack or stroke. This was acute psychological trauma. Something triggered a massive stress response that caused him to lose consciousness. His brain activity during the episode was consistent with someone experiencing severe PTSD flashbacks." She glanced at Maya, who was listening from her chair with growing dread. "He keeps repeating a name. Emma. And he's asking for the girl with the ring." Marcus nodded grimly, having suspected as much. Theodore had never spoken about his daughter to anyone outside his immediate family, but Marcus had been his lawyer long enough to know that Emma's disappearance had hollowed out the man's soul. "Can we see him?" Marcus asked, already knowing the answer. "He's sedated for now, but he should be conscious within the hour. Whatever happened tonight, it's brought something to the surface that's been buried for 15 years. Maya's hands trembled as she touched the ring around her neck, the simple piece of jewelry suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She had no idea what connection it could possibly have to Theodore Blackstone or to someone named Emma, but the evidence was undeniable. Her innocent comment about her mother's matching ring had triggered this crisis. She thought about calling her mother to warn her that something strange was happening. But what could she possibly say? How do you explain that mentioning a family heirloom had caused one of the world's most powerful men to collapse? Sarah was probably asleep in her chair by now, the television playing old movies that she watched but never quite remembered, lost in the fog of dementia that seemed to thicken with each passing month. Maya made a decision that would change everything. She pulled out her phone and took a photo of her ring, then sent a text to her mother's caregiver. "Can you take a picture of Mom's ring and send it to me? Something important has come up." The response came back within minutes, and Maya's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the image on her screen. Her mother's ring was identical to hers in every detail, except for the size. It was clearly the original, an ornate sapphire masterpiece that belonged in a museum rather than around the neck of a dementia patient in Chinatown. The sound of footsteps in the hallway announced the arrival of someone new, and Maya looked up to see a woman in her 40s, striding toward them with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being in charge. This was Rebecca Torres, Theodore's head of security and the former FBI agent who had been searching for Emma Blackstone for the past 15 years. She had been called in from her home in Westchester the moment Marcus realized that tonight's incident might be connected to the kidnapping case that had consumed her professional life for over a decade. Rebecca's sharp eyes immediately focused on Maya, taking in every detail of her appearance with the trained observation skills of someone who had spent years hunting predators and protecting victims. "You're the waitress," she said, her voice neutral, but carrying an undercurrent of intense interest. "Tell me about the ring." It wasn't a request. It was a command from someone who had spent 15 years following every lead, chasing every shadow, interviewing every witness who might have information about Emma Blackstone's disappearance. Maya found herself explaining the story again, her voice growing smaller with each word, as she realized that what she had always believed to be a simple family heirloom might actually be evidence in one of the most high-profile kidnapping cases in American history. Rebecca listened without interruption, but Maya could see the wheels turning behind her eyes, the careful analysis of someone who had learned not to believe in coincidences. Theodore Blackstone's eyes opened to a world that felt fundamentally different from the one he had inhabited just hours before. The private hospital suite was quiet, except for the soft beeping of monitors and the distant hum of Manhattan traffic 40 floors below, but his mind was anything but peaceful. The sedatives had worn off, leaving him with crystal-clear recall of everything that had happened at Elite, every word Maya had spoken, every detail of the ring around her neck, every impossible implication of what her innocent revelation might mean. He had spent 15 years accepting that his daughter was dead, building his life around that terrible certainty, but now that foundation was cracking under the weight of new possibilities that he didn't dare believe. A gentle knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and Marcus Webb entered carrying a folder thick with documents and a tablet computer loaded with information that had been gathered in the few hours since Theodore's collapse. "How are you feeling?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he was more interested in getting answers than providing comfort. Theodore struggled to sit up, his body still weak from the psychological shock that had overwhelmed his system. "The girl, Maya, is she still here?" he asked, his voice hoarse but determined. "I need to see her. I need to see the ring." Marcus nodded, having expected this request. "She's in the waiting area, and Rebecca is interviewing her now. But Theodore, before you see her, there are some things you need to know." Marcus opened the folder and spread several photographs across the bedside table, each one showing Maya from different angles, captured by the hospital's security cameras. "Look at her face," he said quietly. "Really look at her." Theodore stared at the images, his trained eye taking in details he had been too shocked to notice in the restaurant. Maya's facial structure, the shape of her eyes, the way she held her head. There were subtle similarities to features he remembered, genetic echoes that could be explained by coincidence or by something far more significant. Her mother's name is Sarah Chen, Marcus continued, consulting his notes. She's 57 years old, lives in Chinatown, suffers from early-onset dementia, but here's what's interesting. There's no record of Sarah Chen existing before 1995, no birth certificate, no social security number issued before that date, no employment history. It's as if she materialized out of thin air 28 years ago. Theodore's heart began to race again, but this time it wasn't from shock, it was from hope, a dangerous emotion he had trained himself not to feel. "The ring," he whispered. "Did you get a photo of her mother's ring?" Marcus handed him the tablet, and Theodore's hands shook as he stared at the image on the screen. It was Emma's ring, unmistakably and impossibly Emma's ring, the custom piece he had commissioned from the finest jeweler in New York for her 16th birthday. Every detail was perfect, from the intricate phoenix design to the specific shade of blue sapphire that he had selected to match his daughter's eyes. Rebecca Torres chose that moment to enter the room, her expression grim but charged with the electricity of a hunter who had finally caught the scent of her prey. "I've been working this case for 15 years, she said without preamble, "and I've never seen evidence this compelling. The ring is just the beginning, Maya's age, her mother's mysterious past, the complete lack of documentation before 1995. If Sarah Chen is Emma Blackstone, then Maya is your granddaughter." The words hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled, and Theodore felt his world shift on its axis once again. A granddaughter. A piece of Emma that had survived, had grown up, had become a young woman working multiple jobs to support the mother who had raised her with no memory of her previous life. Theodore closed his eyes and tried to imagine it. Emma, alive but lost in the fog of dementia, spending the last 28 years believing she was someone else entirely. And Maya, his granddaughter, inheriting his daughter's kindness and strength, wearing the ring that connected her to a family she never knew existed. "Bring her in," he said finally, his voice steady despite the emotional earthquake happening inside his chest. "I need to hear her story. I need to understand what happened to my daughter." Rebecca nodded and moved toward the door, but Theodore called her back. "And Rebecca, start tracing every hospital record, every Jane Doe admission, every missing person report from the months after Emma disappeared. If she survived that kidnapping, someone helped her disappear. Someone wanted the world to think she was dead, and I intend to find out who." "Dai." Maya entered Theodore's hospital suite with the nervous energy of someone who had been summoned to meet a king. Her eyes wide as she took in the opulent surroundings that looked more like a luxury hotel than a medical facility. Theodore Blackstone, despite being dressed in a hospital gown and connected to various monitors, still radiated an aura of immense power and authority that made her feel like she was shrinking with every step. But there was something else in his expression now, something she hadn't seen in the restaurant, a desperate vulnerability that made him seem almost human. "Please, sit," he said, gesturing to a chair beside his bed. His voice was gentler now, stripped of the cold indifference she remembered from Elite. "I need to ask you some questions about your family, about your mother, and I need you to know that what you tell me might change both of our lives forever." Maya perched on the edge of the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the ring around her neck catching the soft light from the bedside lamp. She had been thinking during the long wait in the corridor, trying to piece together any connection between her modest life in Chinatown and this billionaire's world of unimaginable wealth and power. The only link she could find was the ring, but that seemed impossible. Her mother had owned it for as long as Maya could remember, a treasured heirloom that connected them to a past that dementia had stolen away. "Tell me about your mother's ring," Theodore said, his eyes fixed on the small replica around Maya's neck. "When did she get it? Where did it come from?" Maya's voice was soft and uncertain as she recounted the familiar story. how her grandmother had passed it down, how it was supposedly a family heirloom, how her mother treasured it as her most precious possession even as her memory faded. But as she spoke, Theodore's expression grew more and more intense, and she could see Rebecca Torres taking notes in the corner of the room, as if every word Maya said was potential evidence in some invisible trial. "The thing is," Maya continued, her voice growing stronger as she sensed the importance of what she was sharing, "my mother doesn't remember getting it. She doesn't remember much of anything before I was born. She had some kind of accident when she was younger, before I came along. Hit her head really badly, and when she woke up in the hospital, she couldn't remember who she was or where she came from. The doctor said it was retrograde amnesia. Her past was just gone." Theodore's breath caught audibly, and Maya saw tears forming in his eyes. Though she couldn't understand why her mother's tragic story would affect a stranger so deeply. Theodore reached into the bedside drawer and pulled out a leather portfolio, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it to reveal a collection of photographs that had been his most treasured possessions for 15 years. The first image showed a beautiful teenage girl with dark hair and bright eyes, laughing at something beyond the camera's frame. Maya gasped involuntarily. The girl in the photo looked exactly like Maya herself had at 16, down to the shape of her smile and the way her hair fell across her shoulders. "This is my daughter, Emma," Theodore said, his voice thick with emotion. "She disappeared 15 years ago when she was 16 years old. She was kidnapped from our estate, and despite paying the ransom, she never came home. The police, the FBI, private investigators, everyone told me she was dead." He turned the page to reveal another photograph, this one showing Emma wearing the exact ring that now hung around Maya's neck, the sapphire gleaming in the sunlight as she held it up to show off the intricate phoenix design. "I had this ring custom-made for her 16th birthday," Theodore continued. "It was one of a kind, designed specifically for Emma, with phoenixes to symbolize rebirth and renewal. There has never been another ring like it in the world." Maya stared at the photograph, her mind reeling as the impossible became undeniable. The final photograph in the portfolio showed Emma standing next to a woman in her 30s, both of them laughing at some private joke. Maya's heart stopped as she recognized the woman. Older, yes, and with a different hairstyle, but unmistakably her mother. Sarah Chen, the woman she had known all her life as her quiet, gentle mother who worked as a seamstress and hummed forgotten lullabies while making dinner. "That's my mother," Maya whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's Sarah, but her name in the photo, it says Emma Blackstone." Theodore closed his eyes, tears streaming freely down his face as 15 years of grief and desperate hope finally found resolution. "Your mother is my daughter," he said, his voice breaking on every word. "Emma Din Blackstone, who disappeared 15 years ago and has been living as Sarah Chen ever since. Which means you're not just Maya Chen, the waitress from Chinatown. You're Maya Blackstone, my granddaughter, the child my daughter raised while living with no memory of the family that never stopped looking for her." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Maya's sharp intake of breath, as her entire identity shifted in the space of a single sentence. Everything she thought she knew about herself, about her mother, about their quiet life of struggle and love, it was all built on a foundation of lost memory and stolen identity. She was the granddaughter of one of the most powerful men in America, the daughter of a kidnapping victim who had survived against all odds, the living proof that love could endure even when memory failed. While Maya struggled to process the revelation that had shattered her world, Rebecca Torres was already 3 steps ahead, her investigative instincts firing on all cylinders as she began to unravel the conspiracy that had kept Emma Blackstone hidden for 15 years. She had spent the night making calls to contacts in law enforcement, pulling strings that she had cultivated during her time with the FBI, and accessing databases that most people didn't even know existed. The picture that emerged was both shocking and methodical. Someone with significant resources and inside knowledge had orchestrated Emma's disappearance with surgical precision, ensuring that even if she survived the initial kidnapping, she would never be able to find her way back to her old life. Rebecca's phone buzzed with incoming reports from her network of private investigators, each message adding another piece to a puzzle that was revealing itself to be far more complex than a simple kidnapping gone wrong. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a retired NYPD detective who had worked the original case and had always suspected that someone close to the family was involved. He had kept copies of files that should have been destroyed years ago, and now those files were painting a picture of betrayal that reached into the very heart of the Blackstone empire. The detective's information led Rebecca to a name that made her blood run cold. James Morrison, Theodore's former business partner and the man who had been positioned to take over Blackstone Technologies if anything happened to Theodore or his immediate family. Morrison had been the picture of loyalty and support during the investigation into Emma's disappearance, offering rewards, coordinating with law enforcement, and publicly standing by Theodore's side during the most difficult period of his life. But the retired detective's files contained bank records that told a different story. Large cash withdrawals made by Morrison in the days before Emma's kidnapping, payments to offshore accounts that couldn't be traced, and most damning of all, a series of encrypted communications between Morrison and known criminals who specialized in high-profile abductions. Rebecca cross-referenced these findings with hospital records from the tri-state area, looking for any Jane Doe admissions that matched Emma's timeline and description. What she found sent chills down her spine. A young woman matching Emma's exact physical description had been admitted to Mercy General Hospital in Albany, New York, 2 days after the kidnapping, suffering from severe head trauma and complete memory loss. The admission paperwork had been signed by a doctor who, it turned out, had received a substantial anonymous donation to his research fund just weeks before Emma's disappearance. The conspiracy was beginning to reveal itself in all its calculated cruelty. Morrison hadn't just arranged for Emma's kidnapping. He had planned for her survival, knowing that a living witness with amnesia was actually more valuable to him than a dead body that might eventually be discovered. With Emma's memory erased and her identity lost, she could never expose his involvement in the crime, and with Theodore consumed by grief and convinced of his daughter's death, Morrison could continue his slow takeover of the company without interference. But Morrison had made one critical mistake. He had underestimated a father's love and a daughter's strength. Theodore had never stopped looking, and Emma, even without her memories, had managed to create a new life filled with the same kindness and determination that had characterized her original identity. The final piece of evidence that Rebecca needed came from an unlikely source, Morrison himself. In his arrogance, he had kept detailed records of his crimes, encrypted files on his personal computer that documented every payment, every communication, every step of the plan that had destroyed the Blackstone family. Rebecca's team of forensic computer specialists had been monitoring Morrison's digital footprint for years, waiting for the right moment to strike, and now that moment had arrived. Marcus Webb received the call at 3 in the morning, his phone buzzing with the urgency of someone who had just uncovered evidence of a crime that would reshape everything they thought they knew about the case. "We have him." Rebecca's voice crackled through the encrypted connection. Morrison orchestrated the entire thing, the kidnapping, the cover-up, Emma's disappearance, everything. "I'm sending you the files now, but Marcus, this goes deeper than we thought." He wasn't just stealing money from the company, he was positioning himself to take over completely. Emma's kidnapping was supposed to be the final blow that would drive Theodore into complete withdrawal from the business world. Marcus sat in his study, surrounded by legal documents and case files that suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the evidence that was now flooding his inbox. Bank statements, communication intercepts, medical records, and most damning of all, a video confession that Morrison had apparently recorded for his own protection, outlining his entire plan in methodical detail. The man's hubris was staggering. He had actually documented his crimes as if they were a business proposal, complete with risk assessments and profit projections. "How long before we can arrest him?" Marcus asked, his legal mind already calculating the steps needed to bring Morrison to justice. "The FBI is moving now," Rebecca replied. "They'll have him in custody within the hour. But Marcus, there's something else. Something that's going to complicate everything. Morrison isn't working alone. The medical records show payments to multiple doctors, hospital administrators, and even law enforcement officials. This conspiracy reaches into every level of the system that was supposed to protect Emma. The arrest of James Morrison at his penthouse apartment in Tribeca was carried out with the kind of precision that comes from 15 years of patient investigation and careful preparation. Rebecca Torres stood in the hallway as FBI agents broke down the door. Her badge displayed prominently as she watched the man who had destroyed so many lives being taken into custody. Morrison had been sleeping peacefully in his $10,000 silk sheets, dreaming of the empire he had built on theft and betrayal, when the harsh reality of justice finally caught up with him. He didn't resist. Men like Morrison never did when confronted with overwhelming evidence of their crimes. But the look of cold calculation in his eyes suggested that he was already planning his defense, already thinking about how to manipulate the legal system that he had corrupted for so many years. Rebecca felt a grim satisfaction as she watched him being read his rights, knowing that this moment represented not just the end of Morrison's criminal career, but the beginning of healing for a family that had been torn apart by his greed. The evidence against him was overwhelming: financial records, communication intercepts, witness testimony, and most importantly, the living proof of his crimes in the form of Emma and Maya, the two women whose lives he had nearly destroyed. Back at Mount Sinai Hospital, Theodore Blackstone was struggling with emotions that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 15 years. The man who had built a tech empire through cold logic and calculated risks was now faced with the most human of experiences: the joy of finding his lost daughter and the rage of learning who had taken her from him. Maya sat beside his hospital bed, still wearing her stained Waitress uniform, still trying to process the fact that her entire life had been built on a lie, but also beginning to understand that she was part of something larger than she had ever imagined. "He's been living off the money he stole from us," Theodore said, his voice tight with controlled fury as Marcus briefed him on Morrison's arrest. "Building his own company, buying influence, corrupting the very people who were supposed to find Emma. All while I was grieving for a daughter who was alive and struggling to survive with no memory of who she really was." Maya reached out instinctively and took her grandfather's hand, a gesture that seemed to ground him in the present moment. "But she did survive," Maya said softly. "My mother, Emma, she may not remember being your daughter, but she never lost the part of herself that made you love her. She raised me with kindness and strength and unconditional love, even when she was battling her own demons. Morrison may have stolen her memory, but he never stole her soul." Theodore squeezed Maya's hand, feeling a connection to family that he had thought was lost forever. The ring around her neck caught the light from the hospital room's chandelier, and he was struck by the symbolism of the phoenixes rising from the ashes. Emma had survived, had been reborn as Sarah Chen, and had created new life in the form of Maya, who now sat beside him as proof that love could transcend even the most devastating trauma. "I want to see her," Theodore said, his voice filled with the determination that had been missing for 15 years. "I want to see Emma," Sarah, my daughter. I want to bring her home." Maya's eyes filled with tears as she thought about her mother, confused and fragile, probably wondering where Maya had gone and why she hadn't come home from work. "She won't remember you," Maya warned gently. "The dementia has gotten worse over the years. Some days she doesn't even recognize me. It might be too painful." "I don't care," Theodore interrupted, his voice strong and certain. "I lost 15 years with her because of Morrison's greed. I'm not losing another day. If she can't remember being Emma Blackstone, then I'll learn to love Sarah Chen. If she can't remember me as her father, then I'll introduce myself as a friend. But I will not let her spend another day struggling alone when she has a family who loves her." The journey from Manhattan to Chinatown had never seemed longer to Maya as she sat in the back of Theodore's private car, watching the city transform from gleaming skyscrapers to crowded streets filled with the sounds and smells of her actual life. Theodore sat beside her, no longer the intimidating billionaire who had collapsed at Elite, but a nervous grandfather about to meet the daughter he had lost and the granddaughter he had never known existed. He had changed out of his hospital gown into a simple sweater and slacks, wanting to appear as non-threatening as possible to a woman who would have no reason to trust a stranger claiming to be family. Rebecca Torres rode in the front seat, her trained eyes scanning the neighborhood for potential threats, while her heart ached for the reunion that was about to take place. She had spent 15 years searching for Emma Blackstone, following every lead and chasing every shadow. And now she was about to witness the impossible. A daughter coming home to a father who never stopped believing she was alive. The car pulled up in front of Maya's building, a narrow tenement wedged between a dim-sum restaurant and a shop that sold herbal medicines. And Theodore stared up at the crumbling facade that had been his daughter's home for 15 years. Maya's hands shook as she unlocked the door to their small apartment, calling out softly to warn her mother that she was bringing a visitor. "Mom, I'm home. I brought someone to meet you." The apartment smelled of jasmine tea and the herbal remedies that Sarah used to manage her condition, and every surface was covered with the small treasures that she collected during her confused wanderings. Smooth stones, pressed flowers, scraps of colorful fabric that caught her eye. Sarah Chen was sitting in her favorite chair by the window, wearing a faded bathrobe and holding the ring that had started this entire chain of events. She looked up as Maya entered, her eyes showing the blank confusion that had become all too familiar. But there was also a flicker of recognition that suggested she knew something important was happening. "Who is this man, Maya?" she asked, her voice carrying the careful politeness of someone who had learned to navigate a world that often felt foreign and threatening. Theodore stepped forward slowly, his heart breaking, as he looked at the woman who had once been his vibrant, brilliant daughter, now diminished by trauma and disease, but still unmistakably Emma, in the shape of her eyes and the gentle way she held herself. "My name is Theodore," he said softly, sitting down across from her so that they were at eye level. "I'm a friend of Maya's. She told me that you have a beautiful ring, and I was hoping you might show it to me." Sarah looked down at the ring in her hands, her fingers tracing the familiar phoenix design that had been her anchor through 15 years of confusion and memory loss. "It's very old," she said, her voice taking on the dreamy quality that often accompanied her discussions of the past. "I've had it for as long as I can remember, though I don't remember much, you understand. The doctors say I hit my head very badly once, and everything before that is just fog." Theodore nodded encouragingly, fighting back tears as he listened to his daughter describe the trauma that had stolen her life from her. "It's a beautiful piece," he said, his voice steady despite the emotional storm raging inside him. "The phoenixes are particularly well crafted. Do you know what phoenixes represent?" Sarah smiled, the first genuine expression of joy that Theodore had seen on her face. "Rebirth," she said with certainty, "rising from the ashes. Maya's father used to say that no matter how badly life hurt us, we could always begin again. Though I don't remember Maya's father very well either. He left when she was very young. The moment stretched between them, filled with the weight of 15 years of separation and the tentative hope of reconnection. Theodore reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph, the same image of Emma wearing the ring that he had shown to Maya at the hospital. "This might sound strange," he said carefully, "but I think I knew you once, a long time ago. Before your accident, you were very important to me then, and I've been looking for you ever since." Sarah took the photograph with trembling hands, studying the face of the young woman who looked so much like Maya, but whom she couldn't remember being. "She looks happy," Sarah said wistfully. "Whoever she was, she looks like she was loved." Theodore's voice was barely a whisper as he replied, "She was loved. More than she ever knew, and she still is." In that moment, something shifted in the small apartment in Chinatown. The past might have been lost to trauma and time, but the present held infinite possibilities for healing, for love, and for the kind of family reunion that happens not through the restoration of memory, but through the simple act of choosing to care for each other despite everything that had been lost. The ring caught the afternoon light streaming through the window, its phoenixes seeming to dance as 3 generations of the same family sat together in the quiet understanding that love finds a way to survive even the most devastating attempts to destroy it. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan had become the epicenter of one of the most sensational criminal trials of the decade. James Morrison sat at the defendant's table in his prison-issued suit, a far cry from the designer clothing he had worn while building his empire on stolen foundations and broken lives. The evidence against him was overwhelming. A paper trail of corruption that stretched back 15 years, documented conversations with known criminals, and the testimony of dozens of witnesses who painted a picture of a man so consumed by greed that he had orchestrated the kidnapping of a teenage girl to advance his business interests. Maya sat in the gallery beside her grandfather, both of them serving as living proof of the human cost of Morrison's crimes. Their presence a constant reminder to the jury that this wasn't just a case about financial fraud. It was about a family torn apart by calculated cruelty. Theodore had hired the best legal team money could buy, not for revenge, but for justice, understanding that only by exposing every detail of Morrison's conspiracy could they ensure that no other family would suffer the same fate. Rebecca Torres testified for 3 days, methodically walking the jury through the investigation that had finally brought Morrison to justice, her voice steady and professional, even as she described the years of false leads and dead ends that had kept the Blackstone family trapped in limbo. The prosecution's star witness was an unexpected one. Dr. Michael Harrison, the physician who had treated Emma at Mercy General Hospital 15 years ago. Harrison had kept silent about Morrison's role in Emma's disappearance for over a decade, but the weight of his complicity had eaten away at him until he could no longer live with the knowledge of what he had done. He testified that Morrison had approached him weeks before Emma's kidnapping, offering a substantial payment in exchange for his cooperation in creating a new identity for a young woman who would be arriving at his hospital with severe head trauma and memory loss. "He told me she was a runaway from an abusive family," Harrison said, his voice heavy with shame. "He said he was trying to protect her by giving her a fresh start. I believed him because I wanted to. The money would fund my research for years. But when I saw the news reports about Emma Blackstone's disappearance, I knew I had been manipulated into becoming an accessory to kidnapping." Morrison's defense team tried to portray their client as a businessman who had made questionable choices but hadn't intended to cause permanent harm. But their arguments crumbled under the weight of evidence that showed the kidnapping had been planned with military precision. Financial records proved that Morrison had been embezzling from Blackstone Technologies for years, using Emma's disappearance as cover to accelerate his theft, while Theodore was consumed by grief and unable to focus on business operations. The most damaging testimony came from Morrison himself, whose arrogance and lack of remorse became apparent the moment he took the witness stand. Under cross-examination, he showed no genuine regret for the suffering he had caused, instead focusing on the legal technicalities that he believed might reduce his sentence. Emma Blackstone was never supposed to be permanently harmed, he testified, his voice clinical and detached. The plan was for her to be returned safely once the business transition was complete. The head injury was an unexpected complication that actually worked to everyone's benefit. She was able to start a new life without the trauma of remembering the kidnapping. The courtroom erupted at this callous assessment, and Maya had to be physically restrained by court security as she stood up and shouted, "She's not a business transaction. She's a human being who lost 15 years of her life because of your greed." The judge's gavel rang out like gunshots as order was restored, but the damage to Morrison's case was complete. The jury had seen his true nature, the cold calculation of a man who viewed other people as chess pieces to be moved around for his personal advantage. When the verdict was read 3 weeks later, Morrison was convicted on all counts: kidnapping, fraud, conspiracy, racketeering, and a dozen other charges that would ensure he spent the rest of his life in federal prison. The Blackstone family's new life together began not with fanfare or media attention, but with the quiet rituals of ordinary domesticity. Theodore had purchased a house in Connecticut, close enough to the city for business, but far enough away to provide the peace and privacy that Sarah needed as her condition continued to deteriorate. The house was designed with Sarah's needs in mind: wide hallways for when she eventually needed a wheelchair, a garden filled with the herbs and flowers that brought her comfort, and a suite of rooms on the ground floor where she could live with dignity even as her independence faded. Maya had quit her job at Elite and enrolled in Columbia University to study journalism, funded by a trust fund that Theodore had established in her name. She spent her mornings in classes and her afternoons with her mother, reading to her from books she couldn't quite remember enjoying and helping her tend the garden that had become Sarah's primary source of joy. The routine was peaceful, but tinged with sadness, as each day brought new evidence of Sarah's declining cognitive abilities and the gradual erasure of even the memories she had built as Sarah Chen. There were moments of clarity when she seemed to recognize Theodore as someone important, though she never regained any memory of their life together before the kidnapping. But there were also moments of profound connection when she would hum the lullabies that Theodore remembered from Emma's childhood, or when she would touch his hand and smile with an inexplicable sense of trust and affection. Theodore threw himself into creating a legacy that would honor both versions of his daughter: the vibrant Emma, who had been stolen from him, and the resilient Sarah, who had survived against impossible odds. He established the Emma-Sarah Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting families affected by kidnapping and human trafficking, with a particular focus on helping victims recover from trauma-induced memory loss. Rebecca Torres left her position as head of security to become the Foundation's director of operations, using her investigative skills to help other families find missing loved ones and navigate the complex aftermath of violent crimes. The Foundation's first major initiative was the development of a revolutionary treatment center that combined cutting-edge neurology with compassionate care, providing hope for trauma survivors who had been told their memories were irretrievably lost. Maya became the Foundation's youngest board member, her unique perspective as both a victim and survivor bringing authenticity to their mission. She wrote articles about her experience that were published in major magazines, helping to raise awareness about the long-term effects of kidnapping and the need for better support systems for families dealing with memory-related trauma. Her writing was praised not just for its emotional honesty, but for its refusal to sensationalize the tragedy, instead focusing on the resilience of the human spirit and the power of love to transcend even the most devastating circumstances. The media attention that surrounded the Morrison trial had made the Blackstone family's story a sensation, but Theodore was careful to protect Sarah from the scrutiny that came with their newfound notoriety. He hired a team of publicists whose only job was to keep reporters away from the Connecticut house, ensuring that Sarah could live out her remaining years in peace rather than as a curiosity for the world to gawk at. When journalists did manage to secure interviews with Theodore or Maya, they spoke not about the sensational details of the kidnapping, but about the importance of supporting research into dementia and traumatic brain injury, using their platform to advocate for others who were facing similar challenges. The ring that had started everything, Emma's original sapphire ring, was placed in a position of honor in the Foundation's headquarters, displayed alongside photographs of all the families they had helped reunite. Maya still wore her smaller replica every day, but now it represented not just a connection to a mysterious past, but a bridge between two worlds, the life her mother had lived as Emma Blackstone and the life she had built as Sarah Chen. The phoenixes carved into the silver seemed more meaningful now, their wings spread in eternal flight, rising from ashes that could never quite be forgotten, but no longer had the power to destroy the love that had survived them. In quiet moments, when Sarah would forget who Maya was or where they were living, Maya would touch the ring and remember that some bonds transcend memory, that love finds a way to endure even when everything else has been lost to time and trauma. 2 years after that fateful night at Elite, Theodore Blackstone stood before a gathering of lawmakers, medical professionals, and victim advocates in Washington, D.C., delivering testimony that would lead to the passage of the Emma-Sarah Act, landmark legislation that mandated better coordination between hospitals, law enforcement, and missing person databases to prevent cases like his daughter's from falling through the cracks of an overburdened system. His voice was steady and authoritative as he described the failures that had allowed Morrison's conspiracy to succeed, the bureaucratic incompetence that had kept a kidnapping victim invisible for 15 years, and the reforms needed to ensure that no other family would endure the same nightmare. Maya sat in the audience, now a senior at Columbia with a double major in journalism and victim advocacy, taking notes for the article she would write about the hearing for The Atlantic. She'd become one of the most sought-after young writers in the country, her unique perspective on trauma and recovery giving weight to pieces that examined everything from corporate crime to the ethics of memory recovery research. Her mother was at home in Connecticut, tending to her garden with the help of a full-time caregiver who had become more like family than hired help, living a life of simple contentment that bore no resemblance to the chaos of her teenage years, but was no less precious for its quiet dignity. The foundation that bore her name had grown into a national organization with offices in 12 cities and an annual budget that rivaled some government agencies. They had successfully reunited over 300 families, helped pass legislation in 8 states, and funded groundbreaking research into trauma-induced memory loss that was revolutionizing treatment protocols around the world. Rebecca Torres had become something of a legend in law enforcement circles, her methodical approach to cold cases and her uncanny ability to spot patterns that others missed, leading to breakthroughs in investigations that had been stalled for decades. She still wore the same no-nonsense suits and maintained the same professional demeanor that had intimidated criminals for years. But there was a lightness in her step now, a sense of purpose that came from knowing that her skills were being used to heal rather than simply to punish. The wall of her office was covered with photographs of families she had helped reunite, smiling faces that represented not just successful cases, but human beings who had been given back pieces of themselves they thought were lost forever. At the center of the wall hung a professional portrait of Theodore, Sarah, and Maya, taken on Sarah's 60th birthday, all three of them wearing subtle versions of the phoenix design that had become the foundation's symbol. Maya's book, The Ring of Memory, a granddaughter's journey through loss and discovery, had become a bestseller and was being adapted into a major motion picture, with all proceeds going to fund research into dementia and traumatic brain injury. She had been careful to tell the story with honesty, but also with respect for her mother's dignity, focusing not on the sensational details of the kidnapping, but on the smaller moments of grace that had defined their life together. Sarah's gentle humming while cooking dinner, her delight in small treasures found during walks through Chinatown, her fierce protectiveness of Maya, despite her own confusion and vulnerability. The book had resonated with readers not because of its connection to wealth and power, but because it spoke to universal truths about family, love, and the courage required to rebuild a life from fragments of memory and hope. Critics praised Maya's mature writing style and her ability to find meaning in tragedy without minimizing its impact, comparing her work to that of established authors twice her age. But Maya's greatest satisfaction came from the letters she received from other families affected by similar traumas, thanking her for giving voice to experiences that had previously been invisible to the wider world. On quiet Sunday afternoons, when the demands of business and advocacy could be set aside, the three generations of the Blackstone family would sit together in Sarah's garden, sharing meals and conversation that required no memory of the past to be meaningful in the present. Sarah might not remember being Emma, the vibrant teenager who had once dreamed of changing the world, but she had become something equally valuable, a woman who had survived unimaginable trauma and had somehow managed to raise a daughter filled with compassion and strength. Theodore might never recover the 15 years he had lost with his daughter, but he had gained a granddaughter whose wisdom and empathy had taught him that wealth meant nothing without family, that success was hollow without love, and that the most important victories were not won in boardrooms, but in the quiet moments when people chose to care for each other despite everything that tried to drive them apart. The ring still caught the light during these gatherings, its phoenixes seeming to dance in the afternoon sun, a reminder that some things are too precious to be destroyed by time or trauma or the cruelty of those who mistake power for strength. As Maya would write in the final chapter of her book, the ring had taught them that love, like the mythical phoenix, has the power to rise from any ashes, stronger and more beautiful for having survived the fire that tried to consume it.